A force-directed graph is a class of algorithm that is used for layout of data, and it's often being used to drawing graph in a pleasing to the eye way, and it can be used for mechanical springs, behavior, network visualization, knowledge representation, etc. So in the next two sections, we're going to build two of them. We're going to create a bubble chart, and we're going to create a force network chart. So force network chart, you can see we can actually it's like a spring that will do the calculation, and you can see what we're going to be building with the bubble. We can change the data and we can animate the data. So we can create animation, we can change the data, and we can display in a visual way information. So in this section here, we're going to create a bubble chart to display multiple circles in a two-dimensional plot. And what you can see, what we've done here is I took all the libraries that we're using out of the Create React app must-have libraries. And for example, Puppeteer, Lodash, Helmet, Snap, Recoil, all those libraries, and we're representing them in a circular way. And then we can change the data and we can animate the data. So we're going to be building this in this section. We'll start by creating a new project. So we're going to use the Create React app must-have libraries. So I'm going to take the yarn command and we'll call the project bubble chart. So download it and set it up, and then import it with your favorite IDE. The first thing, we need to import some of the libraries we're going to be using. So we need to add d3 and types d3. We need to add d3 force and types d3 force. And then another thing we're going to do is, so far what we've done is, oops, I have a typo. Let's fix that. d3 types, and d force and types, d3 force for TypeScript. And then the other thing we're going to do is, so far we worked with function component, but I want to show you how you can work with d3 in React using class component. It's a little bit different because we're not using the hooks, the use effect hooks, but because there's predefined hooks in the class. So I just want to show you the difference. So we'll use that for our component. So if you go into component README file, you'll see that there is already a d3 class template that I set up for you. So it's a type of d3 class. So we're going to use that. And for the component name, we're going to call it bubble chart. And let's take a look. Okay, great. So take a look, we got our component, and again it includes the CSS file, the test file, and the component itself. A good place to start is really creating the types. So we've done this before. So just create types of, and we'll do, it's a TypeScript file. And what we're going to do is we're going to create our export the namespace, and we'll call it types. And we're going to create two types. One of them we'll call it data. That's going to be our data. And it's going to consist of a few things. We're going to give it an ID of type number. We're going to give each one of those bubble a name. So that's going to be a string. We're going to give them a size to each bubble. And then we're also going to pass on the fill color. And that's going to be of type string. The reason I'm doing it that way, to kind of give control over those bubbles for the data, instead of having everything drawn randomly or however we decide. So I'm kind of giving the control to the data itself. And then another thing we're going to need, so I'm going to create it already, is we need to create a type that's called force data, and that's going to be used by D3 to create the size of the bubble. So you'll see we're going to use it later. So now that we have our type ready, go back to app, and this is the vanilla code out of the gate. And what I did do is I added a D for the data, and I created all the data, a data object that holds all those names of libraries. For the size, I just put random size, but it could be tied to, for example, the popularity of the library, and the same with the color. You can see I just, you could see the color using the IDE. It shows us the color. So I just picked random colors, and I used all the libraries that are used in our Create React App template project. And now we can actually define it to be of types data. Okay. Let's make sure you import the types, and we're importing it from the bubble chart. Okay. Now that we have the types, we can add the bubble chart component. So just let's get rid of all the header, and let's include the new component we created, bubble chart. Be careful because there's also a material UI icon called bubble chart. So we need to make sure we select the component one. Okay, great. Now we can take a look at our component. Our component is made out of a few things. It already has pre-built reference, it has the constructor, it has component did mount, and it has rendering and props and a state. Now when I'm running yarn start, looks like there's some kind of problem in app.tsx, so let's take a look. Yeah, it looks like the data type, it needs to be an array of that type. So the type is just one object, but we need an array of that object. So we need to change in app.tsx to an array of that object. It also, we're not using logo.svg, you can delete that. Let's try it again. Great, so we have our class component. This is really what we created in the first section of this course. So when I showed you how to work with the class component and function component, we created the two squares and the hello world. And now we can really start create our bubble component. A good place to start is in bubble chart component. We can set the props and we can set the state. For the props, we're going to pass in that bubble data that we set, and that's going to be of type data, and it's an array of data, and then we can pass some properties like we did with function component, the dimension. We can pass the width, we can pass the height, we can pass the background color in case we want to change that dynamically. We can pass the text fill color that we're going to use for the bubbles, and we can for the state we can set the data that D3 is going to use. D3 is going to need that force data we set inside of our type. That's going to be an array. So if you look at the force data, it just gives us the size of the bubble. That's what D3 is going to need. And we need to make sure the types are imported. Okay, now on the rendering side, we have a div. Let's just simplify it. We'll call it chart. We don't need the reference, so let's get rid of the reference. Okay, and then we have our div, then we have our SVG, and that's it. Inside, we're gonna use a function to generate that. So what we can do is we can create a function, and let's call it render bubbles, and then pass the data, and then return we can actually return the a JSX component. It's going to look like that. I can return a JSX component. So now on the render, we can just call that component we created. It's going to look like this. I can do this dot render bubble, and then pass the bubble size, which will be in the state data that we just set, and it needs to be an array. Okay, and then for the SVG, it already has a width and a height set with our default template, so we can just point it to our props that we set. So I'll just, in class component, you have to always do the this. So this width, and the same with the height. I'm just going to point it to bind it to our width and height. And then for the div itself, we can do the same with the props for the background color. So I can just set the background and point it to the props background color. And then the other property I want to set is we want to, once the user hover over the div, I want to give it a cursor style. So you do that by just setting the cursor to a style pointer. Okay. The next step is we'll create our scale. So we can call the scale radius scale, and we can pass the value, and the value is going to be a d3 numeric value. And then when we pass the number, we can generate our scale. So we can create a constant, let's call it fx, and that would, then we'll use d3 to, and we'll use the scale square, and then we need to set the range, and we need to set the domain, and then we can return our function and convert it with the scale we just created. So in the function component, we put the helper here. Instead of using the helper, I'm just creating everything in the file. We can also use that helper, but since we don't need the x-axis, y-axis, we just need bubble, then it's simple enough to just do it this way. I know that the range is going to be between 1 to 50, so I want to bake the values instead of doing some calculation. And the same with the domain. What I want to do is I want to bake those properties in for the minimum and maximum value. So go back into our to the props, and we'll just add a minimum value that we'll use for the domain. So it's going to be of type number, and the same with the maximum value. This way we have a little bit more control instead of just giving it some calculation. But we could as well calculate this to check what is the minimum and maximum value, but I just want to have a little bit more control over what's going on. Our range needs to be put into an array. And the same with the domain, right? We have to put it inside of an array. Okay. Let's see, we got a couple of errors. Okay, in the state, we need to set the state. It has to match. So if you remember, if you look at the bottom of the file, we set data. So we need to do the same in the constructor, right? So we need to set the data, the default value. The default value, we can just leave it as an array. Then we're not using the reference, so we can get rid of it. And on the component did mount, we don't need to use the reference, we can delete that. Any of this stuff, because we don't need to generate that vanilla code we have, so I'll just leave it to do. Next, we need to simulate the force graph position. So D3 can help us with that. We can create a method for that. Let's call it simulate positions. And that's going to take that data type that I set for us. So if you look, remember we had that force data that it's include the size. And that's of type array. And then we're going to return a data that will calculate the position for us. So to do that, we can use a simulation. And we're gonna reuse that simulation, so we can just create it as a private property for our class. So let's create a private simulation, and that's gonna be of type the D3 simulation, D3 force, and it takes two properties, so TypeScript won't complain. So one of them is going to be the simulation. I checked it out at the doc, so it needs to be simulation node dtom, and the next one we're just going to set it as undefined. And now we can take that simulation. Let's first fix the import orders and clean up some of the imports we're not using. Okay. Now we can take our simulation and use them in our simulate position method that we're creating. So we'll call this simulation, and then that will equal our D3. And then we can call the force simulation. See, it's really similar how we do in transition. We're just calling force simulation, and then we tell D3 how to handle this. So even though we're not using a typical chart, the concept is really still the same. We pass the data, and we need to convert the data. If you remember, we set it as simulation data node dtom or undefined. So we need to pass that, so it knows what kind of data to expect. And then we need to set few properties. We need to set the velocity decay, and this we can extract it to the props, but now I'll just set it here. And then we need to tell it which element to force. So we want to force the X element, and we want to force the Y element. For the X element, we can take help also from D3 and called force. We'll call force X, and then we need to give it. Oops, something broke. Yeah. Then we need to give it the strength. So the strength, again, we can extract that as a property. For now, I'll just give it some kind of strength. And the same with the Y. Let's give it the same strength for the Y position. And then it's almost like we're orchestrating how we want to do the force. So it's really similar how we handle interaction. This time we're just handling something a little bit more complex. and then we can tell the force how to handle it. So we can create a collide between our bubble, and then to create that we'll take help also from D3, and we can do force collision, and it expect our simulated data DTOM, so we can do pass inline our data, which will be simulated data node DTOM, so it already knows, and then we can return. Then we need to get the value, so we can use the radius we just set, radius scale, and then we can pass the data and then the size, and that will calculate the collision using our scale. Now it doesn't like this because it doesn't know the type, so we need to set the type as types force data, so it knows that it has the size. Okay, looking good. And then the next thing we want to do is we want to create some kind of interaction. So on every tick we want to create a collision. So in order to create a collision, we need to, just like with interaction, we need to know what to do, and we can use an interval, but D3 has something we can use, is we can use the tick. So on every tick, until the collision stop, we can set the state to the new data, like that. Let's make sure there's no errors. It looks like we have an error for the property simulation. So it's complaining because I'm not setting up, I'm just setting up the private method, but I'm not initializing it. So what we can do is we can just tell our class that it could be undefined, and that way it will allow us not to define it. Now that we have the simulated position, the next thing we want to do is we want to create some kind of method that will take the simulus position and will push the data, and we only want to do it once. So what we can do is we can create an animate bubbles method, and what we can do is we can check if the props, the bubble data we're passing from the parent component, if the length is greater than 0, meaning this is it got set because on the first run it won't load the data, so we don't want to run the simulation with empty value. Now we can call the simulate position, and here we need to pass the data, but the data we're going to pass is not going to be the data we're pushing from the bubble data, because of a couple of reasons. First of all, it only needs the size, and then we don't want it to manipulate the data. So what we need to do is we need to create an internal variable that we can use just to hold whatever D3 needs. So what we can do is we can just add inside of our class just another variable. So we can do it here, and I'll make it a public, and then I can call it force data, and that would be of types force data array. And then when we call this, when we simulate the position, we'll use that force data array instead of using our prop. Then the other thing we need to do, so far so good, but there's one thing we need to do is we need to set the force data array that we just created. We need to initialize it. So in the constructor, we can initialize it. We can tell it, hey, the force data, it needs to equal the our data prop, but we need to iterate through that, and then we need to extract from that just the size. So we need to do that. So we can put it here under the component did mount. So we can set the first data, and we can pass the props, and then we can return. Why is it? Okay. Because I didn't put equal. Okay, and then what we can do is we can create a constant and return that constant. Okay, so now in the constructor, the first data will be set for us. Now to set it, what we really need to do is we need to iterate through the results. Let's see why it's complaining. 1 second. Because we need to do this. That's the big difference between when you're working with the function component or a class component. Everything has to do this because you reference the class. And in function component, we don't need to do that. So it's good and bad, right? Because we get more. This is like a full-fledged OOP, and function component is more simple in that way. But the big advantage is that we get all the hook, like component did mount and all that stuff out of the box here, instead of us having to set that up. So next, what we need to do, we need to iterate through our data, and then we need to extract the size. Okay, so we can just iterate through that. So we can just say, hey, if the bubble, will just iterate through the entire bubble object. There you go. And then what we can do is we can just take the data. The return has to be after the loop, of course. And then we can take the data and we can push an object that holds the size. And the size would be our props bubble data index that size. Okay, and what this will do is we're creating a new, we're like cloning our data, and we're creating a new object that just hold our size. We're setting it up as a constructor, and now when we animate the bubble, is using the force data instead of using our actual prop, which is what we want to do, because it's going to manipulate the data, and we don't want, and it's also, we're kind of breaking the architecture if we're manipulating the prop from React. So we don't want to touch the data from React. That's why we have to create another data to handle that. And then in the component did mount, then we can just add this animate bubbles. There you go. Which we'll call the animate bubbles right here. Let's see, just check there's no errors, no errors. Okay, so we do have one error here. It needs to be I less the length, otherwise it's going to break. And then go back to the app TSX, and we want to set all those properties that we're passing, like the width. Let's collapse this. So we need to set all those variables. For the width, we can give it 800 pixel. For the height, we can give it 600 pixel. And then for the text fill color, I'm just going to use a keyword color space. I'll just use dark gray. And for the minimum value, we can pass 1, and the maximum value 150. So this is based on the data that I set. I set it from up to 350, but I can actually limit it and say, hey, we just want the domain between 1 to 150. So we can, the fact that we have more value doesn't mean that we have to use that. It's up to us. It's not mandatory, right? So we can tell it exactly what value to set our domain. Now we also need the bubble data. For the bubble data, I can just pass the entire data object, but instead let's do something else. What we can do is I can set a state and I can slice up the results, so I'm not passing everything. So let's create a data state, and what we can do is we can slice the results. So it's going to be of types data, and it has to be array. Don't forget, let's import the types. Okay. Oops, that's going to be this bracket. And then for the initial value, we can take the data. Let's see if the import didn't come through. Okay, make sure we have the imports. Did it go through? It has to be capital, right? Yeah. And now for the initial value, we can take the D object that I set here, D, and then I can actually slice it a little bit between first value and the 10th value. That way we're not showing all the results, and we can update the results if we want. And then on the bubble data, we can pass that data object. Okay, it's the bubble chart is complaining because we need to also put the background color. For the background color, let's use the white color. And also for the, if we open up the app SAS file, the color is right now gray. I'm going to change it to white as well. Now make sure there's no errors. It looks like it's complaining about the indent, how it's indented. It was missing a space. And save it, let it get re-indexed. Okay, great, no errors. Next, go to bubble chart component, and what we need to do is we need to handle how we render our component. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna return the JSX code, and the way we're gonna do it, we're just gonna take our data and map it. We could have put it in line, but this is a much cleaner way of doing it. So the item, we're going to use the item, we're going to use the index, and then we can return whatever we want to render. There you go. So again, this can really become complicated, so just make sure everything, there's no errors and it's been done right, and that's a good way to do it, to really work on the code so it's really clean. And then what we can do is we can use some of the properties that we set, so we can create a constant of this, so our props will be available for us. And then we need to figure a few things out, so let's set those things like the font size, and we can use our radius scale to figure out the font size based on our item size. So what we can do is we're mapping through the item, so we can just do item size, and then we can divide that by 4, so we know that way the label of the bubble will fit. TypeScript doesn't like that I just call size because it doesn't know what type of object this is, so we need to tell TypeScript. So first we need to convert it as unknown, and then convert it as our type for its data. Then we also need to set the content. So our content is going to be really our we have a property for name. So what we can do is we can use that. So bubble data, and just make sure that we don't exceed the size. This will avoid any problem. So if the index is not exceeded, if the length is not exceeded our index, then we can call our bubble data with the index and take the name. And if it does exceed, then pass nothing. And this will avoid any type of potential errors that we can have if the index exceeded. And we can do the same with our stroke color for our bubble label. So we can create a stroke color and use the same technique as we did here. Make sure we don't exceed the size, and either use dark gray or we'll use white, which is our background color, whatever background, because we don't want to show stroke if it's exceed. That's it. Now in the return, we'll set it up with few components. We're inside of this is embedded inside our SVG. So first we need to wrap it in a group. Then we'll put a circle for each bubble. And then we're going to put a text label. Okay. Now for the G, because we're mapping, we need to set a key. So for the key, what we can do is use that library that we used before, UUID. So just do UUID. Again, it doesn't have a TypeScript yet, and I don't want to set one, so we'll just use a require. And make sure in terminal that you add that yarn add react UUID. Okay. And now we can use that to generate our key. So go back to the render bubble. And for the key, we can just use template style and just call it group and UUID. And then we need to, let's collapse this so it's easy to see what's going on. Then we need to put a transform element, and in our transform element, we're going to translate to our position, and I'll just use our width and height to position it. So I'm going to use the props width divided by 2. I want half of that. And we want to add the item X location, and I'm just going to put an offset, and the same for the height. For the height, we're going to use the props height and divided by 2, and add the item Y position. Now take a look here, we're returning twice, so we can clean that up. Also, the X and the Y and the velocity, what happened is that when we had the method for D3 to simulate the position, it took our first data, and the first data had only the size, and then it added the X, Y, and the velocity for the collision. So what we need to do is we can go into type and create another data type, and we can call it, let's say, first data complete. And then we need to add those types that D3 added for us on our data, which is the X, Y, and velocity. And now when we map the item, we can tell our mapping class that the types is going to be first data complete, and that way we have the X and Y and velocity won't break. For the circle, if you look back at the CSV cheat sheet, you could see it needs few properties, right? It needs the CX, CY, and the radius. So for the radius, we can use the scale we created. So what we can do, we can just use the item and pass the radius scale inside the item, and it's the size of the bubble that we use for the R. Then we need a couple more things. We need to pass the fill. So for the fill, we already have the bubble data, so we can just use the bubble data from our prop and pass the index of the current bubble, and then we can use the fill color. For the stroke, we can use the stroke color we just set up here, you see? And for the stroke width, this can also go into a prop, but I'm just setting it up at 2. Then one more thing we're going to do is we're going to set a style so the cursor shows as a pointer. That way we can will allow the user to click on each one of those bubbles to get some additional information. Refresh localhost, you could already see that the bubbles are showing up, so everything looking great. Now the last element we need to work on is the text. So we want to put the label of each one of those element. So what we'll do is we'll use the fill for the text, and we can use the props text fill color that we pass from the parent component. For the text anchor, I want to align it to the middle of the bubble. For the font size, we already, if you remember, we set it here, the font size, so we can just use that using template style, because we need to, it needs to be in pixel, so we can just use font size and make sure it comes with the pixel for it to show. And then for the font weight, I'm just going to use normal. I also want to give the text a little bit of a shadow. So to do that, we can assign a class name, and let's call it bubble text. And in the bubble text sass file, I have already I set up a CSS that will generate a shadow around the text. Then here you can see I'm closing the text file, but if we want to put the content, we need to put it inside and bind it content, and then I'm binding it to the content element that we created, that including the name. Now when I'm refreshing localhost, you could see everything, it's working. It's look like we have a shadow, we have the label. One problem that I see here is that you see the location of the text. I want to push it down a little bit, and if you go to the CSV cheat sheet, there's a property on the text that's called dy, So we can use the dy to just move the location a little bit down. So let's do that. So just add dy, and I can give it a value of 6. That will just push it a little bit down. Let's take a look. Refresh localhost. There you go. You see how it pushed a little bit down? So that's great. Looks like, it's working. I have all the bubbles. The only problem that we have here is that they're overlapping each other. So we need to put some code so it would not overlap, and we need to put some more code that will allow us to change the data and animate those bubbles. So we'll do that in the next section.